Hi, my name is Caryn Bursch. I'm a doctor of audiology. I recently graduated from Salus University, and it's through Salus that I began to enjoy the prospect of testing for auditory processing disorders. I have been testing for about 3 years now, and there's a lot of research. In order to do the testing, I've dropped everything else in audiology except for basic clinical audiograms. I think that's the way to approach auditory processing disorders, is not to try and do it on the fly, not to just give some tests and give the standard amount of recommendations or the standard recommendations, not always recommend an FM system. I think you really need to get up to your eyeballs in this before you're comfortable and that you really feel comfortable in what you're doing and confident. I want to thank ASLPA for giving me the opportunity to talk about auditory processing, as it is something near and dear to my heart. I think one of the first things we need to look at when we're talking about auditory processing is a team approach. I've seen a lot of reports from Florida, from Burlington, all around Ottawa, and it's the team approach that's missing. When we look at a child, we need to look at not just the auditory processing part, what's coming into the brain. We need to look at how the child can deal with what's coming into the brain. And then we also need to look at how he expresses himself. Is something getting lost in translation? So our part as audiologists is to examine how things get from out here into the language area. The speech-language pathologist will look at the language part, and a psychologist looks at the cognition. I really don't think that auditory processing can be looked at in and of itself. And as I wrote in my article, it's like kicking the tires of a car and proclaiming it's fine. We really need to get involved in teamwork. And just to give you a visual, there we go. Cognition plays a big part. Memory and attention are also very important when we're looking at auditory processing disorders. Auditory processing is not too dissimilar from attention deficit disorder. A lot of the symptoms are the same, they're just in a different order. So we need to look at attention. That's in fact one of the tests that should be run, I think, before any auditory processing testing is done. We need to look at whether the child is able to pay attention to what can be very long tests. After the team approach, we need to look at our test batteries themselves. There is no golden standard for test batteries. I think ASLPA is currently working on looking at a test battery, what would be appropriate. And when I developed mine, it took me months. I wanted to cover both function and anatomy. These two things cannot be really separated. There we are. Auditory processing is done in several parts of the system. We need to look at brainstem function, we need to look at the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere, and the corpus callosum that joins the two, in order to make sure or find out where in that system the breakdown is occurring. Function, Asha lists a bunch of auditory processing functions. I believe I do in my article as well. We need to have tests that look at each of those functions. What is that child supposed to be able to do auditorily? So the tests need to cover both anatomy and function, and that's why it took me months to come up with the test. I also included tests that weren't so heavily linguistically loaded in case the child is language impaired. We need to look at those factors as well. So it comes up to a pretty big test battery. And I recently came across an article by Jane Ann Fair, and she had mentioned that the scan, which is very popular, I see, as part of comprehensive testing, it belongs in the screening domain. So that's something that's really kind of gotten under my skin, looking at all the audiologists who tend to put that in the comprehensive examinations. Now that you've done the testing, you've reviewed the psychology and speech-language pathology reports, you have results to look at. What do we do with the results? We need to look at whether the auditory processing issue is a primary or a secondary problem. In other words, is the child's difficulty understanding what's going on or their slow reactions, is this all due to auditory processing? There's a lot of debate about whether you can have a single modularity when it comes to auditory processing or whether it's involved with other factors. Either way, I think it's really important to distinguish whether this child's difficulty is only auditory processing or whether it's due to things like cognitive factors, Asperger's syndrome, autism, borderline cognition abilities. So it's very important that people know that this is not just, they can't blame all the child's problem on auditory processing. And you can say, he does have auditory processing disorders due to other factors. This also comes into play with the recommendations. If in the case that there are secondary or primary problems that are causing a secondary auditory processing disorder, we need to outline the functions that the child can't do, their strengths, their weaknesses, and then what do we do in the classroom in order to help them out, and at home. The recommendations of your report should really include direct intervention. I use a speech-language pathologist. I always refer out to a speech-language pathologist for therapy. So intervention, what kind of compensation can the child use? Do they use a study buddy, a partner? And the speech-language pathologist, especially if the problem is in prosody, will give them hints on how to interact socially, as well as things that they can use to help themselves in the classroom. The last part of your recommendation section should involve environmental modifications. That doesn't mean that every child gets an FM. There are auditory processing difficulties that do better with an FM system. As well, there are auditory processing difficulties that don't need an FM system. Things like prosody. It's not going to help if you don't understand intonation to make it louder. So keep that in mind. And if you're already testing auditory processing, if you plan on testing auditory processing, I think it needs to encompass a big part of your audiology career. Again, not something you can do on the fly. Fortunately, where I work, I was allowed to get all the tools that I needed, the time that I need. I have great receptionists who pre-screen the children and make sure I have the reports at hand when I go to test. And I've been given the freedom to get up to my eyeballs in this. So good luck if you're testing, and email me if you're having problems. Thank you very much.